But yeah, that's a nice immature scarlet ginger, maybe immature maybe. And by the time it comes back in spring, it'll be
Well,
like.
in the last one, I think we're down to 4
And the other one was with some sort of a brush, some sort of a wobble.
Okay.
I would say something like probably Cape May.
Here's this one.
Well, that's what. So you just. There's a page. Using all ones that look just like the one you have. And difficult to, now, so you can get a picture of it. It's right.
All rise.
Walk around enough.
Ham flowers, right?
What's that?
A ham?
Well, a hymn. Ooh, the voice doesn't extend to sleeping.
Needs a gavel for all rise.
Well, thanks everybody for joining me. This is my first trip to Marshall. I'm so flattered to be invited. I've had a blast hanging out with the vendors and people involved in this community outside. The grounds look fantastic. Really, this is one of the best public native herbaceous plantings I've seen. And so I've got so many photos to take back to me, to my home in the Triangle, where I have a landscape architecture practice focused on ecological planting design. My name is Preston Montague. I'm a landscape architect and an artist, originally from Charlottesville, Virginia, but now I practice in the Triangle. There's a lot of blood flow, but I have to come to the mountains here, not only for inspiration, but for so many patterns in vegetation that I have to bring back, because there's so few examples around me that really illustrate what the vegetation would naturally do. I have to come to places that are a little bit more preserved and maybe even a little bit wetter, so I see what happens when you turn the volume up on particularly herbaceous plantings. And today what I wanted to do is really explain to you guys my approach to coming up with ideas and committing to those ideas relative to the arrangement of vegetation in a landscape, because I find that a lot of people that I work with and a lot of presentations that I give, it is that first move of what and where that people really struggle with once they get really amped up about not only participating in the improvement of the ecology in their home landscape, but learning a little bit more about what's there and what perhaps should be there. But making those initial decisions, I find people get really locked up. And today what I want to talk to you guys about my process for looking at the big picture and zooming in to make those decisions. And so today's presentation is roughly in 3 parts. And we're going to start off looking at how I make decisions from the big picture to a finer picture, and explain how shrubs plays a role in a lot of those decisions. And then following this presentation, I'd love for you all to join me as we put a garden together right here just outside the building. Plant material is ready to go. We've got tools ready. I think many hands make light work. We can knock it out really quickly, but we'll be putting a garden together using seed, shrubs, trees, and herbaceous plants. So please join me. I think we can knock it out real quick and have a lot of fun after this. So without further ado, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the context in which I practice. Increasingly, it feels like I practice in Zone 8A. I live in the center at the highest ridge in downtown Durham. So my garden is windswept, sun-blasted. It is a brutal environment. I'm not working with soils that anyone would confuse as natural, nor am I dealing with hydrology that is at all really natural. And so really, I feel like I've got some room to exercise creative license relative to the vegetation I select. So it's like, how do I make a decision where I don't necessarily have to obey any kind of like strict ecological program for my potential site? How do I come up with a decision in that regard. But you guys may be practicing in very different conditions, or you may be practicing with an established landscape. The vast majority of my projects in the triangle, speaking about context, is new construction. And there is a luxury in that blank canvas often, but it means that I am beginning ecologies from the start. And that has implications relative to having clients recognize what I've put in and accept as something that still needs to cook. Furthermore, we're experiencing differences in heat, differences in rainfall intensity, differences in the intensity of rainfall. And this next slide explains all of it. There we go. But even before I begin the investigation into what are the most appropriate decisions I should be making, I have to remind myself that as a designer, it's critical that I decenter myself, that I'm no longer practicing the sort of landscape design that I was trained to do or that my ego demanded, that in fact I am designing for species who don't have a voice and that they are my priority, not my aesthetic preferences, which I've lost track of hopelessly now. At this point, I've been practicing in the service of pollinators and birds and bats, but I kind of don't even know what I personally like anymore. I think that's okay. When it comes to making decisions about what native plants I want in my landscapes, I like to find natural precedents to build off of. And so I do a lot of hiking and camping, and a lot of the photography that I bring back with me is my recipe. And so I try and find analogous environments that I can find to bring back into the environments that I practice in, which are typically surrounded by asphalt and concrete, lots of lawns, lots of rooftops, lots of driveways. So, coming to the mountains around Asheville doesn't always help me, but going to the mountain balds, going to Hanging Rock, going to Pilot Mountain closer to Greensboro, some of the granite outcrops near me in eastern Wake County, those provide clues to how vegetation behaves and appears to survive those sorts of environments. And so rather than big, wide leaves that evapotranspirate really easily, I find plants that have thin, narrow strap-like leaves that are better adapted to surviving in the hot, gnarly environments in which I practice. Additionally, as you're trying to make decisions about how to make a decision, having goals in mind gives you something to aim towards. It makes you a more efficient decision maker. And a lot of the goals I ask my clients to have in mind are, what species do you want to appeal to and bring to the garden? What sort of experiences do you want to have that certain vegetation can support? Really ultimately having goals and identifying either an ecological type that you want, some sort of natural vegetation organization that you experience out in the wild. Let's say, if I want to recreate the rhododendron-rich forests of certain parts of Hanging Rock relatively close to me, that demands a lot of attention to the soil and the canopy trees that I would want to put in there. And so designing for shrubs, I find, often requires paying attention to the vegetation that creates the conditions in which they'll thrive. Rhododendron won't survive near me in Durham unless you're on the north face and on the Eno River. It's the only place we find them. Otherwise, it's just this kind of disjunct population, if I'm getting my terminology correct. If I were to even dare to drag a rhododendron through, let's say rhododendron catawbias, for example, I would have to plant trees. And so that takes some upfront planting, not just an impulse buy at the garden center, which I'm also notorious for as well. And increasingly, I'm trying to figure out, how do I reduce my intervention? Like, how do I step into a space and identify what's already working, if anything, and build off that, increasingly trying to reduce the number of moves I make, largely because practicing the triangle is different than how I practice in Asheville. I think to a certain degree, here you have a residential sector where people are have access to resources and time and are motivated. In the triangle, it's a different demographic moving into the residential sector. People are just getting started with their families and their careers, and their interest in having a landscape, I find, is largely emotional. And there isn't necessarily the time or motivation to follow up on its care or its planting. And so I've had to be ruthlessly innovative with how I help people in the triangle plant their landscapes. And what that's created is basically a career of mine is not creating beautiful gardens, but just doing decorative environmental restoration for people whose kids and dogs don't really go outside, and they just don't necessarily have the capacity to manage an 1/8 or 1/2 of an acre to which they just bought to get out of, let's say, an apartment in a more intense city. And so that's the context. And I just want to kind of like be really quite open and honest about where I'm practicing, because that may trigger a set of different decisions that you guys may make in a different context. Additionally, expanding on existing resources is very closely related to reducing my intervention. And what I'm looking for is vegetation opportunities, material opportunities, maybe on-site or adjacent that I can bring in. For example, I usually need a lot of organic matter because it is no longer necessary to sign off on a site having completed the stormwater or the erosion control. That's old, that's done. It's if you get the house built and it's not sliding down the hill, you can just about like lay a little hay on the bare dirt and walk away. We're building that fast in the triangle. And so a lot of my work is about, okay, are there any tree companies nearby that we can have tons of wood chips brought to the site to at least begin establishing a layer of organic matter? And so I encourage you guys to identify those resources around you, both in material and in plants, or potentially in labor that can help you build the garden that you need to. And lastly, because specifically the triangle has so much recently cleared land, so many parking lots, so much asphalt, so much concrete, when I have clients who ask me for ecological garden design, I need to amplify the resources those landscapes create to compensate for a lack of resources from the other 9 neighbors who just take whatever fescue the builder left behind. So usually this involves having patches of annuals and sunflowers or some other things or having water in the landscape. So you hyper concentrate resources in the landscape beyond the perennial resources of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants. All right. So just to help design from a bird's eye view, for those of you who get in and dig in, this may be a step that perhaps you haven't considered, but if you design first as the bird, I find that you bring in tenets of ecology help me make initial decisions. And so when I walk onto a property, the first thing I do is look at it on Google Maps, and I try and identify 4 types of landscape environments, and that would be the patches. And these patches, the patches are going to be relatively intact, whatever that means. It's subjective, I think, compared to the rest of the environment around it. But patches of environments that already have some quality and some integrity and some resources, again, that I can build off of. Sometimes a patch may just be, for me in the triangle, one mature oak tree on the corner of the property, and that's the only intact habitat that I may have been left to work with. And then there's corridors, and these are often these linear landscape types, these vegetation types that connect your patches and are so critical not only for the movement of insects, birds, bats, but also for plant species. This is often how seeds migrate from one patch to another, often connected to either the gardener or to animals. And corridors tend to be when I walk onto a property where the fence line presents an opportunity, where the foundation plants around the house present an opportunity. And there's also the edges where all the magic happens. And this is where naturally the sun gets in and presents heat and light resources that typically a lot of the flowering shrubs that I work with survive in and thrive in. This is where I do a lot of my herbaceous work. The edge is the interface of an open space and a more closed corridor or patch space. And so what I'm trying to do is leave areas of stable patches that have interiors that may be stabilized because they're big enough to not be disturbed by human activity as much. And so you often get species in the interior of patches because the patch protects those species. And so the corridor is meant to transfer genetic material from one patch to the next. And it's the edge is at the front where you interface the patches and the corridors. And typically an edge would be people's shrub border, their screening. And then lastly, there's the open space. And this is typically your lawns or a lake or a pond, or basically it's an expanse where vegetation is pretty minimal. And this I find is an important place that birds make a lot of decisions about the health, about the capacity of the landscape around them to be a safe place to land and make a decision. I think for human beings, I've never had a client ask me to close their property off entirely. There is an opportunity to not only create an open space that performs as a place for human activity, but it's also a way to let the light in to allow the edge to do what it does best, which is be a high energy place where a lot of your flowering plants are going to survive. Furthermore, as I consider the decisions that I'm trying to make, I look at the Sustainable Sites Initiative, which is like LEED for landscape architects. It's a set of values and rules that help landscape architects make excellent decisions relative to development. That is basically kind of a guidebook for sustainability. And so some of the many things that I take from the Sustainable Sites Initiative is it gives me kind of like a hierarchy of decisions about how to approach land. And so the first one is to conserve. And the point of identifying areas of the landscape to just practice conservation is like those patches. These are areas where animals are behaving, plants, there's basically energies happening that I don't know much about and I don't want to interrupt. So the only thing I want to do in certain parts of the landscape is just remove the invasive species and allow the wild energies to cultivate that space and do things that I don't even realize it's doing. And I think that's very, very important. And for some of my urban clients, that may be 10 square foot in a back corner behind a shed where we just don't do anything. So the native bees at least have some open ground to drill holes in to survive the winter. And so if I'm looking at like a neighborhood like this, I would look to these large patches in the far corners away from a lot of human activity, and I would designate those as areas to conserve, where my only activity is to remove invasive species. When it comes to managing areas, these may be areas that have a lot more human influence on them, and it may require a little bit more to manage that environment than just removing the invasive species. Managing that site may be opening it up a little bit to let some light in, to allow an herbaceous layer of plants to reemerge, to reconstitute the corridors with some of that genetic material. And so management of spaces does require a little more horticulture knowledge and some goals in mind. But in the case of designing this neighborhood, I would start to step in towards the human zones to try and figure out how can I manage, let's say, the front edge of the patch so that that patch doesn't become too stable and lose biodiversity. And it could be the kind of thing where could I turn some of the canopy trees on the edge of the patches, cut those down, allow them to become wolf trees, but have, basically smaller trunks and lower canopies, which might allow for stages of vegetation that birds can make a decision in which to enter either the corridor or the patch. So basically there's this, this kind of outer rim in which I just like to practice conservation landscaping, just removing invasives. And then on the face of that, that's where I might basically do a little bit more management. I'm not really adding, I'm typically subtracting when I'm managing the edge of a patch. There are areas that I really want to restore. I know that it's challenging to see the difference between the yellow and the green here, I apologize. But when you're restoring habitat, you're looking for clues about what sort of vegetation the site demands. And a lot of times the patch or any intact corridors can give you clues about how that vegetation wants to express itself. And when I'm restoring habitat, usually it's in the next layer closest to the house or living spaces, and it requires even a lot more intervention than conservation or management. And so when I'm restoring habitats like this, usually what I'm doing is restoring some sort of ecological function around the base of the house, let's say, or this is where my edge is. That conservation and management happens really in the interior of the patches or the corridors. And what I'm trying to do is restore some sort of edge environment, usually to kind of lock that corridor or that patch in place. And by having a screened edge, I really allow for that interior room beyond my handiwork to just develop on its own. And really I focus really on restoring and maintaining the ecology along the edge. And lastly, there are areas I just have to start from scratch. And these tend to be around roadways, around buildings, and places with a lot of energy, but a lot of intervention, a lot of high turnover, a lot of human dabbling. And so these areas where I'm generating new ecologies, novel ecologies, basically, I'm still using cues about environments that I would normally encounter in a place, but sometimes I give myself artistic license to play and perhaps bring in new species that maybe historically weren't there. And I'm not necessarily speaking about anything really very, very exotic, but for my own yard at home, it would have never featured any of the lovely wetland species that I brought into the mix that sometimes allow me to extend the bloom period just in the service of insects I may not realize are coming. And so when I'm generating a new novel ecology, which we all are, as studied and as hard as we work to create or recreate something that exists, we're creating new things. And I think it's a really important, hopefully not a provocative idea, that as tightly as you study the particular area in which your garden is and get native plants that you feel like are historically in that space, because you put it together, it's new. No matter how hard you try to arrange it. So another reason why it's so important to have goals in mind, so that you're not being too arbitrary about your arrangement and selection. And if it's the kind of thing where it's like, I really do want to see more butterflies in my yard, that's a separate road of decisions, say, versus bringing in birds, for example. So I just wanted to show you guys how I would divide up a property, even just mentally, into patches that I conserve, corridors that I maintain, edges that I restore, and open space that I generate that has occasional interventions of new ecologies that are novel. And so, relative also to speaking the language of ecology in the pursuit of excellent design, when I think about what I'm doing to the landscape, I am considering how I am manipulating the structure of the vegetation on a site, how I am manipulating the function of that ecosystem that I'm responsible for, and make decisions about how I want it to change, which will happen the moment you put the first shovel in the ground. How am I going to sensitively control that change in the pursuit of my own goals? And so just looking at what structure means, it's the quality, quantity, diversity, and arrangement of features in that landscape. And so the structure of the forest I'm seeing out the windows is primarily canopied forest with understory trees, some shrubs, and then basically a little bit of an herbaceous condition, but largely the ground cover is seedlings of trees that are beginning to emerge, but they're locked in place because of the shade. That's the structure. And I think one of the challenges we have as a community supporting native plants is once you really kind of look at the idiosyncrasies that make Boone and Asheville so different, it's like, how do we come up with recommendations in Boone that really matter to the nitty gritty down in Asheville? I mean, I think that distance matters, and that difference in rainfall and aspect matters. And it's one of the reasons why I think that folks in Arizona can't necessarily translate a lot of our native plant directives or native, planting directives here, they have to have their own rules as well because the structure of their landscapes is different. The structure of the woods around me in Raleigh-Durham is different than the structure of the woods for you guys up here. And so, I encourage you guys as you're hiking and camping and just driving around, look at how the environments you want to recreate are structured. And do something simple like go out with somebody and measure 100 square foot or 1,000 square foot. And don't necessarily identify the plants except for canopy trees, understory trees, shrubs, and herbaceous. And you may surprise yourself with what the composition of that forest really is, not from your view this way, but from, kind of calculating what's actually really there. You may come up with a formula. For me, it's basically for any kind of patch of land, let's say for 1,000 square foot, if I do 5 canopy trees, 3 understory trees, 10, 12 shrubs, and about 120 to 1,000 herbaceous plants, I create the forest around me in Raleigh-Durham. Relative to the function, that is how that ecosystem basically behaves and performs in relation to other ecosystems. And so for me at the highest hill in downtown Durham, that as an ecosystem functions differently than even just 4 blocks south of me, which is Ellerby Creek. And so what I've discovered is that the function of my ecosystem is to help provide new genetic material that literally flows downhill in stormwater to Ellerby Creek, and to make sure that nothing I plant can potentially spread its genetic material down to Ellerby Creek that I don't want. And so another reason why I have to really be very careful about what I plant, it all rolls downhill very carefully, very quickly for me. But the function of the ecosystem may be a wetland. You may be at the bottom of the hill in your neighborhood. And so the function of your landscape might be primarily to manage the stormwater rushing in from the rest of the neighborhood. And lastly, change, which is essentially those forces that cause change in your landscape that might be something like a destabilizing hurricane wind that opens it up and allows sunlight in, that might encourage a flush of herbaceous vegetation. None of these things we're designing, it changes the second you put the plant in the ground. And so it becomes something that you have to manage and anticipate as well. And so I encourage you guys to document all the ways your landscape, all the forces that change your landscape without your intervention. Do you guys have hurricanes? Do you have fires? Do you have, for me, it is the drought. It's drought that changes my landscape the most. So relative to looking at these 3 characteristics of your landscape, I really just kind of blew through those and I messed up that slide. Ignore that, sorry, thanks, all right. So here's some challenges, some questions that I ask myself. And first of all, how do you know that the way you're arranging plants is going to meet your ecological goals? For me, it still involves, it's a lot of educated guesswork. I'm not only using natural precedents, but also research for making decisions about what's the arrangement and what's the ratio of canopy trees to understory trees that might bring this species of bird versus another. And if I have data demonstrating that this species of bird is experiencing population decline, well, how can I structure the landscape to support that cedar waxwing, say, versus that raptor? Yeah. So how do you know that your plants are going to service your ecological goals? For those of you who perhaps in that bottom of the neighborhood kind of landscape, how do you know that the plants that you're selecting are tolerating the hydrology of that spot? For me, I learned a big lesson relative to native plants when I started building my top of Durham landscape. I was just kind of putting native plants in because all natives work, right? I don't know about that. Most of my early decisions didn't make it. I was like, oh, I'm just plugging in charismatic wetland plants that I got hooked on because my primary place to shop from is a wetland conservation nursery, ACK. And so I learned a big hard lesson there. And I didn't learn how to plant with native plants to the degree that I know now until I noticed that all of the Mediterranean herbs and all of the South African plants that I had also planted were surviving. Why was that? Oh, it's because they had the physiology to handle what I was throwing at them. And so I then found native plants that have similar structures and arrangements that would survive that landscape better. And then how is your landscape going to maintain your ecological goals over time? If it's changing and you're trying to control that change a little bit, how do you manage that change and design that change? And how do you be the hurricane and in a way that supports your long-term goals? For me, the way that I change my tiny little urban front sun-blasted landscape is basically I just come through it like a grazer. And I'm the grazing animal. And I graze it with the weed whacker at a time that doesn't disturb the fireflies. That's one of my goals. I'm happy to be the only property in downtown. My yard's no bigger than this room right here, the only place in the neighborhood with fireflies. How they got there, I think they come from Ellery Creek, but they sure don't stick around anywhere else. And if I graze with the weed whacker at certain times during the year, I've noticed I get less fireflies. And so I've got to be very, very careful with how I am the change in my own landscape. And then also I want us to think about, when we talk about native landscapes and conservation gardening and landscaping with natives, I think that we all get started learning about native plant species. But what if it's not just about the plants? What if there's native structure? What if there's a native function and native change? And what if what if the native structure here is something that you want to aspire to recreate because it works here in Asheville and Marshall area, and the structure that you would put here wouldn't necessarily work in Wilmington? And so as we consider as a broader native plant movement that's perhaps looking at itself at the national level, is understanding how we make prescriptions to one another for our own yards that really reflect the idiosyncrasies of the place. And perhaps getting too nitty-gritty about this, about whether cultivars are valid or not, or whether you're looking for genetic species with genetics that are specifically from a place. Both of those are important considerations. But I'm wondering if, looking back, if you couldn't recreate the structure so that it creates the function you want, but also maybe has a Japanese maple. I know that's very provocative to suggest, but I'm wondering just how concerned that cedar waxwing is about landing somewhere and whether or not the dogwood or the Japanese maple make that big a difference. So it's a thing about asking myself. I know it's probably a provocative thing to mention in here, but at some point, I think as a movement, we're going to have to reconcile with the ornamentalists. And I'm trying to figure out where that reconciliation is going to be, because it's going to happen. Because right now they are winning the war relative to hearts and minds, in a sense that data is coming out about diversity just makes diversity no matter where it comes from. I'm not quite sure that's true, but there's a lot of folks kind of pushing back on the native plant movement, saying, no, we can do what you're trying to do, but we can include grandma's peonies and that one Japanese maple we were gifted. I suspect they're probably right. I think it's about ratios and quantities. And Doug Talley mentions this with his 70-30 rule as well. So, and I don't want to go down, I feel like I'm, going down a rabbit hole that was not intended for today. But I just want to kind of plant that seed that as you're considering an argument against that idea, or even looking at the structure, function, or change of your yard, is it so hyper-focused on native plant species, but can you achieve some of your goals just in the way you organize the plants, just in the way you choose plants that provide a larger function, and the change that you apply to that garden? Do they reflect the native structure, change, and function of where you're at in Asheville? And what does that mean? What sort of moves do you make that reflect an Asheville gardener versus a Raleigh-Durham gardener? So now we've kind of looked at landscapes from the perspective of a bird and we began to look at tenets of ecology to help inform our decision making, I want to talk a little bit about how I make decisions about the furnishings, the plants. And so I like to really reduce vegetation to kind of like Lego blocks. And I teach landscape architecture at the University in Greensboro. And when I have undergrads who are often coming into landscape architecture, I find often with reasons they can't explain. I think there's something just magical about landscape and architecture that causes undergrads to take the major, even if they don't have a relationship with nature, even if they've never planted a plant. But there's just something about those two words combined that I haven't really uncovered the appeal, but it certainly got me. But one of the ways that I began designing as a landscape architect that got me into trouble is that I kind of would like, such a plant geek that I would like walk onto a property and be like, I'd love to see, oh, that'd be a great spot for an azalea, and oh, over here, let's put a dogwood over there where I can see it. And I think a lot of homeowners walk into planting decisions like that. They're weighing not only the experience, but they're trying to manage the results of an impulse buy a lot of times. Or they're trying to conjure perhaps a memory or an experience and hoping that plant in that place will help, kind of strike that chord every time. The challenge with that is it doesn't necessarily consider how that plant's going to perform over time. Will it perform well at all? And what is its relationship to a larger arrangement of plants around it? Furthermore, I don't think it's a really great way, I think there's a better way to walk into a natural precedent. When you're responsible for just making a million decisions every day about what plant where, it forces you to simplify the way you see things. Because it's just too exhausting to recreate all of these conditions in 5 yards a day, let's say. It's important to kind of not miss the forest for the trees. Did I say that right? But anyways, basically what I mean is I like to really kind of literally squint my eyes, relax my vision, let things go blurry, and critically examine habitats that I may want to recreate in a place. And by relaxing your vision, squinting your eyes, letting your vision go soft, basically, you're reducing the amount of information that comes to your brain. And suddenly you can see a little bit differently. I was raised a painter. It's one of those tricks that if you don't have an ally in the studio, you can become your own ally. Sometimes a glass of wine will help you become a different person. You can see things differently, but you can also just kind of relax your vision and see things with a little bit less information. So suddenly you don't see the forest, you see the trees. That's where I was going with that. And so when I have my students think about vegetation decisions, I have them think about them in these building blocks. And I say, okay, we may want to include canopy trees in our design. What if you go ahead and start compiling a plant list of canopy trees you may aspire to have, but have a deciduous list, a list of conifers, and a list of broadleaf evergreens. And depending on your goals, what's the mix of those, if any? If you are aspiring to create 1 million caterpillars and really bring the songbirds to the yard, then canopy trees, deciduous trees, oaks specifically, but also birch and cherry, would be the goal. If you are tired of the hot asphalt and concrete and you want a little more shade, you may find that the near permanent shade of Magnolia virginiana is the appropriate plant for you. And so what you're trying to do is create a list and match services of those plants. And so if what you need serviced is shade, well, boom, you've got a list. You've got something to, you've got a species that might provide that opportunity. Furthermore, I also make a list of understory trees. And I encourage all of you guys to create your own plant lists. And I think even by researching keystone species, you can begin getting short lists of plants that perhaps matter a little more relative to the quality of the ecosystem you're trying to create. And again, with understory trees, I have my students make a list of deciduous understories like red butter dogwood, understory conifers, which for me are native holly, Alex alpaca, and then like broadleaf evergreens, which you probably consider Magnolia virginiana in my world, a broadleaf evergreen. Additionally, I like for people to have a list of vines and lianas. Liana, of course, is like wisteria. It's the woody stemmed vine, and vines are technically herbaceous. So I think we confuse the two terminologies, but these are actually plants that a lot of people exclude from the design of their landscapes, but they have roles in the landscapes. And when it comes to finding homes for vines and lianas, vines, because of their herbaceous quality, I find grow really rapidly, but tend to not crawl up a canopy tree. I tend to position my vines, and there's not many. I usually just use like some passiflora, which is herbaceous, and I'll have that just walk its way through herbaceous planting, or I'll position it near an understory tree where it serves as a trellis. Lianas, like bignonia and wisteria, and like lonicera, I find they have a little more might to them, and they're able to dig in and use a big trellis. So I found that with things like crossvine and bignonia, on a trellis, they just swamp the whole thing and just turn into a big green morass. But when positioned to the foot of an oak tree, there's this just magic relationship they create, where the bignonia just kind of hangs like little earrings in the lower branches and never becomes a real problem. And so suddenly now I'm getting red flowers up into the tree and bringing hummingbird habitat up the trunk of the tree, whereas before a big oak tree never really would have been very interesting to a hummingbird. And so, following a model like this, I might create a guild of plants kind of shaped like this, and you see how the canopy tree and the understory tree relationship is probably very familiar, dogwood under an oak. But then there's always these kind of like little, spaces that you could squeeze a conifer or a broadleaf evergreen in underneath. And of course, positioning the vine at the base of the understory or liana at the base of the canopy tree. I do the same thing with shrubs. I have a list of evergreen shrubs and deciduous shrubs. And in those two broader categories, I break them up into large, medium, and small. And as I'm arranging plants, not only ecologically, but also just culturally, when I'm planting against the foot of the house, I know further out towards the edges, I can kind of do my own thing, but most of my clients will only tolerate green meatballs by the front of the house, because they don't mind if the back gets wiry, but they certainly want the front to represent that they're like plugged in and they're playing ball with society. And that's really, really challenging, because I'm like, okay, well, where do I put the foundation of a house? Well, ultimately, it's my list of small and medium evergreen shrubs. North Carolina, I find, is not a place I find a lot of shrubs. I find more species in the mountains and more species at the coast, but when I'm going around in the Piedmont, I don't see a lot of native shrubs. And that presents a huge challenge for those of us practicing commercial and residential landscape architecture with native plants. We don't have boxwoods, we don't have the Asian azaleas that are so familiar. I can get Ilex vomitoria nana, I can get some of the anise, which I just found this morning, one of which is invasive, which is a real bummer. But there are some real holes relative to finding native plants to do conventional cultural work. And a lot of that has to do with just a lack of native shrub species that I could grow. If I was here in the mountains, I think I've got a wider range of shrubs that I could select. And if I was down at the coast, I could like pretend everything's a picosin and do clethra and Ilex glabra. But if I do a strict Piedmont landscape, I don't know, I can't even name a shrub really. Aesculus sylvatica, the painted buckeye. But I can't really use that. I certainly can't use that in commercial work because of the fruit. You don't want to eat it, it's poisonous. And residential work, I am discouraged from using it. So there's some big challenges relative to shrubs. That's when I have to cheat and get exotic. It's usually with shrubs. But increasingly I'm finding people are opening up to having herbaceous plants. In the context of Asheville up here, it seems like it's so much easier to put herbaceous plantings in because it feels integrated. I'm telling you, the triangle is not a place for herbaceous plants. It's a new thing for a lot of people. And so, people doing it are radical and pushing against the curve and enduring a lot of Neighbors calling the landscape in as a violation to the city. Or dealing with broken relationships with neighbors because they feel like their experience of living in the neighborhood is now broken because they've got to tolerate this mess that they've conditioned to think.
You've got HOAs to deal with.
Right, and, you know, HOAs, many of the HOAs around me in my neighborhood, which is rapid gentrifying, those HOAs are managed in New Jersey, and they don't take phone calls. So there's no reconciliation there, unfortunately. A lot of times those are just kind of lost causes. So furthermore, by the way, as I'm creating my plant list and I'm kind of trying to figure out other resources to provide to meet different ecological goals, I make sure that I also separate my shrubs into seed-bearing shrubs, summer fruiting, fall fruiting, and winter fruiting shrubs. And try and make sure that in my landscapes, if I don't have a very specific goal in mind, what I'm trying to do is make sure I've got a little bit of something for everybody. That I've got some space that's being conserved, some space that's being restored, some space that's being managed, and some space that's being restored. Did I say that? You get it. That I've got patches, corridors, edges, and open space. There's a lot of birds that make the decision in the lawn before they go and find something that they want. And furthermore, make sure that I've got access to canopy trees, understory trees, because I'm finding that the native structure around me is a lot of layers that would not make any sense in Arizona, but they do based on the plant palette that I have. And then furthermore, I try and maximize the food resources like the list you see here. And so basically I come up with a conceptual plant list, and then I kind of go back through and make sure if there's any holes, the gaps of resources, that I fill those in. And so the condition might look something like this. Sorry, which starts to look like a successional model. I'm going to breeze through herbaceous plants so we have time to do our demo outside. But when it comes to herbaceous plants, I categorize those broadly in medium, large, and small categories, because I might just pick medium and small herbaceous plants for a public setting or around the mailbox, or some of these other conditions where I don't want it to come off as rangy. Furthermore, when I'm arranging herbaceous plants, I try and focus on herbaceous plants landing in blocks, drifts, or scattered. Furthermore, I found a relationship when it comes to blocks of plants. Typically, those are my smaller plants where I might find 12 to 24 in a population, like sedges. And I'll do sedges in blocks. And I've noticed that often I see drifts of medium-sized herbaceous plants or grasses. And so I'll typically reserve my blocks for low-growing flowering herbaceous plants or sedges. I'll do drifts of ornamental grasses or some of my medium growing herbaceous, my forbs. And then when it comes to scattered, when it comes to things like Joe Pye weed or sunflower or even some of the really tall hibiscus around me, I find them, they'll be in clumps, but they kind of tend to be scattered throughout the landscape. And so the shape of a plant community, a novel plant community that you're coming up with, and its size has a relationship. So I tend to do, mass plantings of small plants. I tend to reduce those masses of medium plants, and then I just tend to scatter individuals of large plants. That is so invented, but it comes off as natural. Arranging it also in triangles, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, rather than rows, also appears pretty natural. Furthermore, working in odd numbers somehow magically just comes off as a little more natural than even numbers or symmetry. So as I'm making my list, I make sure that I have grasses listed, forbs listed, sedges, and rushes listed, because each four of those categories tackle different goals of mine. And then furthermore, I'm working on understanding native annuals. This is kind of the first year I've been diving into that. These ruderal plants that help colonize and protect the landscape from the weeds as the rest of the more longer lived, slower growing plants come to fruition and start crowding out weeds. So I make sure that I've got annuals, biennials, but certainly perennials, which I think is really where the money's at. And relative to some of my like grasslands that I create, I think what I create are grasslands. It all turns grassy in the Piedmont anyways. You know, so much of our herbaceous planting inspiration comes from Kansas and New York. And we really don't have great resources, in my opinion, in the Southeast that are readily available to help us put these herbaceous plantings together. I think we're all experimenting and looking at Dutch Northeast and Midwest examples and kind of wondering, well, all turns grassy anyways. Well, that's just kind of our climate. All those cute things up, in these really kind of like lovely urban environments, these urban herbaceous plantings that I see in the Northeast, you bring those same species down to the South in North Carolina and they just get 10 times as tall. It's just so hot and wet here, and the season's so long. And so a kind of a complete arrangement might be something like this, where I'm focusing on my ground cover. And this is just the classic deli case style. From any sort of flat surface, your lawn, your sidewalk, the edge of pavement, you just basically work up evenly in height. And for each of these horizontal layers, you're wanting to diversify the grasses, forbs, rushes, sedges in that arrangement. And then once you get a good deli case going, small, you shorten the front, tall the back, mess up its hair a little bit, pull some things in and out, and create a little mystery. You don't want to see the whole garden at one time. That doesn't really encourage you to explore it. But you obscure part of it behind a couple of shrubs, and you can't help but take a stroll with some coffee and see what's going on behind the shrubs. I was going to show you guys some of my yards, but I kind of feel like it's time for us to maybe go outside. Have I hit my time? Okay, I'll skip showing my yard off. Okay, well, that's what I got. I mean, it's just 3 foot of driveway gravel. This is what I inherited. This is, the neighbors called it the rock yard. It was dead. It was not birds wouldn't even fly over it. It was hot, it was miserable. The previous owner did never want to do a drop of landscaping. Even those shrubs are plastic. But it ended up being the fastest growing landscape I've ever installed. It's the drainage. So now moving forward, I don't even mess with the existing soil. We bring in the soil and we make it super drainable. And we'll use things like, you can do it permatil, maybe familiar with that puffed slate material. I just use fine driveway gravel or really wood chips, fine wood chips called soil conditioner. And if I focus on drainage, you can always increase the irrigation, but in a very poorly drained soil, it's very hard to dry it out. So I start off with well-drained and let it become, over time, it gets so clogged with roots and other organic material, it tends to hold on more like a sponge, even if it began its life well-drained. And I found what happened in this landscape is that within a year, the plants rooted so quickly. It's basically a hydroponic system. Water does not stick around that system. But you can imagine how mean the landscape was. Blocks, echinacea in a downtown Durham, it didn't last. These Midwestern plants, or these plants, these cultivars that were developed in the Northeast, I think there's a much bigger story that has yet to be told about what we should be growing here. So this was this popped up first year, looked fabulous, and then fell apart promptly the second year. And it was those Mediterranean herbs that told me, oh, you're planting this wrong. But I enjoy practicing in an urban setting. This is like the selfie spot for the neighborhood. And also look at those Bermuda grass lawns now marching in front of those new $1 million condos in what is basically one of the last remaining working class neighborhoods in Durham. There's a cultural preservation that's happening with my house beyond just an environmental restoration exercise. And then also I want to show you guys another thing that you can create here and in the shade and from seed. So, my landscape is plugs and 1 gallons. This is a landscape, this is one of my clients. You can see that for whatever reason, they needed to destroy the entire backyard to do an addition to the basement. I don't know why they really spread out that much. All the trees you see are dead now, but they're all snags the woodpeckers love. So that was kind of a change. We could have designed that as the change, but it's still, high canopy trees on the sides, and we just made that from seed. And you're catching this at a weird moment. This is like right now. So you're beginning to see the blue mist flower, Conoclonum colostyum, that's doing its thing. You're seeing some sunflowers in there. And the fluffiness you're seeing is agrostis. It's a bent grass, which is my primary herbaceous layer. That's the carpet. And then I've got other perennials like Conoclonum popping up through it. But the reason it's all brown is it's a cool season grass. And you're seeing last year's inflorescences. If I kind of pulled it back and you saw the scalp, it'd be this beautiful carpet of green. And so, yeah, my seed mix includes a lot of bent grass, a lot of that agrostis. And it's basically performs like a fescue, essentially. It's a cool season grass, keeps the cool season weeds at bay, but it creates like a thatch that prevents weed seeds from germinating in the warm season, but allows any sort of plugs or more hardier forbs to come up through it. But this is, technically a shade landscape. And I just wanted to see what year one of a seeded landscape with a seed mix designed for shade, which I've got outside, can do. And so now that we're in the third year of this plant, I really should have uploaded more current pictures. It's fabulous. All of a sudden what's happened is a lot of the other plants in the seed mix that needed a winter or two to get cold stratified and germinate have come up through. So we're seeing, and because it's year 3, we've got a lot more Rudbeckia, it'll go away. But some of the longer lived forbs like the sunflowers, and then we've got some little tootling high bush blueberries in there as well. There's one little stem right there. These high bush blueberries are now beginning to pop up and thrive. They really actually do enjoy the openness of having all the trees in the center of the yard. You die. Because I would love to take this conversation outside and into the garden. Please join me if you'd like. Many hands make light work, as I mentioned, and I think we could knock it out quick. And I'm happy to take questions outside. And I really want to thank Marshall Native Gardens and the library for hosting this. I want to thank Scott for making this like so well run, and Nate Buchanan who initiated an invite, and of course Edward Valley who is part of the organization. I'm so impressed. I really appreciate you guys joining me and giving me opportunity.
You've seen this before. I'd like for you to pick a number between 1 and 8.
Oh, 7.
7. All right. So underneath your chairs, there are a few chairs. One chair has the number 7 underneath it, and
You have